All right, we have got a new set of toy games here. We've got a condensed out of position range versus a linear in position range and a 1-to-1 SPR. So condensed out of position range is queens through sixes. Okay. And the linear in position range is aces through fours. Okay. So in position's got the hands that in position's got the out of position lacks are aces and kings and fours and fives. Okay. So in position's basically got the nuts, and out of position is missing those combos. So go ahead and give some thought to what you think the out of position strategy will look like before you take a look at it. How much betting does the out of position player do? What kind of sizing choices does the out of position player like? How does this differ from out of position being linear and in position being condensed? Give it some thought. It's really helpful if you put it down on notepad or write it down somewhere so that you've got a record of your thought process before we move forward. Okay, cool, great. And yeah, we can go ahead and take a look at what's going on for the out of position player. If you guess that there's not going to be much betting, that was probably a good guess. Okay. So the out of position player now does not do much betting. There's a 73.5% check, and the only viable bet size is to 10% of pot or a block sizing choice. And we can see that the pocket tens is the favorite bet, and it's the hand that bets the most. But very much so, we're not trying to invest a lot of money, right? So the EV for out of position between bet 10% and check are quite comparable. Case in point, even pocket tens, which is the highest frequency block, is also mixing to check. So the EV for all of these hands between blocking and checking is very comparable. If or identical. We can actually look at these; they'll be identical, more or less. So you've got an EV of 41 in both options, and so yeah, you're looking at sub 1% EV differences for sure across all of these hands. So basically, check are the cliffs. So now, why is this happening? Well, the other guy's got the nuts and you don't. That's a big deal. You are heavily disadvantaged. There is room to try to squeeze out some very small betting, but in a situation such as this one from out of position, this is where you want to mostly be checking. And if you just think back to like when you're playing, like what kind of situation is this that's like in game? If the early position player opens and you check call the flop and the turn and then you face the river. Early position player opens, you defend the big blind and you check call the flop and turn and then face and then get to the river. And maybe it was an ace high flop or something. Obviously the in position players can have like pocket aces or ace king or hands like that you're missing. And so the in position player will have hands that are like the nuts that you lack, and you're probably going to check, right? So this is somewhat comparable to a situation like that. Okay, and with that, we can go ahead and take a look at the in position strategy. All right, so now we've got the in position strategy, and so now what does in position strategy look like? And we have a very kind of simple strategy. We're either shoving or checking. We're shoving our bluffs and shoving our strongest value combos, and we have a perfect 2-to-1 ratio for jam, which is great. So 2-to-1 value to bluff ratio. Okay, so if we've got 4 value bets, we've got 2 bluffs. That's perfect. Why is it perfect? Well, 33% of this range, if you're betting pot, 33% of this range should be bluffs. 67% should be value. That comes from, of course, the what the opponent is calling and the pot odds they're getting. So the opponent will be calling if we jam for 100. The opponent will be calling 100 to win 300. 300, where does that come from? Our shove, his call, the pot before the shove. So 100 divided by 300 is 33%. That's going to be the frequency we bluff because, of course, the EV of our opponent's bluff catchers come from the frequency that we bluff, because by definition, a bluff catcher loses to value bets and beats bluffs. So the frequency that we bluff equals the EV of our opponent's bluff catchers, and our opponents will be break even at 33%. If we're bluffing 33% of the time, that's where our opponents break even, which means they have an incentive neither to call all their bluff catchers nor fold all their bluff catchers. So that's the indifference point. And that's what we're seeing kind of manifest itself here, which is very nice, very elegant, very clean. You can see that we're bluffing from the bottom of our range, value betting from the top. Of course, the opponent does not have aces and kings at all. Queens is still the nuts for us on a relative basis, because queens is the first hand, the strongest hand in our opponent's range. And so we're jamming basically, these are the nuts because our opponent doesn't have these hands. This is the nuts relative to our opponent because it's the strongest hand our opponent has. And then this is the second nuts. So we're jamming basically down to the second nuts, checking everything below the second nuts, and then jamming our bluffs at the bottom. So again, very clean construction. Don't have to talk too much about different bet sizes. We're checking our hands that are weaker than our nut combos, checking our hands that are stronger than our bluffs, and that's pretty simple. So we'll call it here. I'll take a look at the versus bet strategy next. All right, guys, this is very quickly going to look at the out of position versus bet strategy. It's going to be a simple one for this. 2 reasons. 1, we don't have to look at in position versus bet strategy because out of position, of course, is basically checking range. And we don't have to look at multiple bet sizes because there's only one that's really being chosen. So this is going to be a pretty fast one. So out of position is going to go ahead and jam with the balanced 2-to-1 value to bluff ratio here. And out of position is, very close to our 50-50 defending frequencies here. And that's just, it's a very like kind of explicable, I guess, calling range. Keep in mind that when the in position player jams, queens and jacks are hands that beat value bets, right? So queens is the nuts, and jacks is the second nuts in the context of this range. And the in position player is jamming jacks. And so we have fully weighted calls on both queens and jacks. And then all hands below jacks are essentially bluff catchers. In this particular model, in position is not bluffing with pocket sixes at all. So even pocket sixes is technically a bluff catcher, even though it's at the bottom of your range. Okay, and so 10s through 6s are all basically worth 0, and they're all pretty much the same hand. So calling or folding. Keep in mind this when it says the call is worth 0.04, it's worth 0.04 chips in the context of a 200 chip pot. So it's not worth much. And so these hands are all basically worth 0. And so these hands are all bluff catchers. They beat bluffs and they lose to value. And our opponent's jamming queens and jacks and bluffing with 5s and 4s. And so these hands, again, in that context are pretty much identical, which produces very similar EVs. Okay. And I guess we can just very quickly establish where this 50-50 call fold comes from, just very quickly again. And it comes from our opponent's risk reward. So our opponent's risking 100 and the reward is 200 after they jam. So we take their 100 chip bet divided by 200. And that equals 50%, which is the frequency at which our opponent is break even when they shove a hand that would otherwise lose. So if they shove a bluff and they win the hand 50% of the time, that bluff would be break even as a bet. And if they shove a bluff and we folded more than 50% of the time, those bluffs would generate profits. And if they made the same bet size shove and we defended less than 50%, if we defended less than 50%, those bluffs would generate profits. And if we defended more than 50%, those bluffs would generate losses. And 50% is the point at which they become break even. Okay, so that's where these kind of numbers come from, just so that you can kind of get these ideas reinforced. And yeah, I think with that we can move on because this is once again not super complicated. So thank you.